Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sark Gutierrez, and today I will be discussing African diasporic elements of Carnival traditions in Rio de Janeiro. I'd like to start with showing you a few images of modern Carnival celebrations within the past decade. Some of the things I'd like for you to notice in these particular images are the clothing that they're wearing, the headpieces, the embellishments, like the overall designs and the detail in their clothings, the overall color schemes, the musical instruments used, the movements that they're doing, and who is participating. You'll notice it's not necessarily only Africans or only Brazilians, it's a mix. And so you can see that with these various images from these different samba groups. I will argue that African diasporic elements shaped modern Brazilian carnival traditions. The focus of this presentation identifies early Afro-Brazilian slave demographics, their native music, instrumentation, movement, religion, and ultimately which influences made it to Brazil, and the eventual process of creolization that took place over centuries of Portuguese ruling and post-slavery influence. One important quote that has stayed with me from my first music history course was from my professor, Dr. Mark Brill, who stated, "When people travel, they carry their music with them." End quote. This statement helped me put into perspective that when we're talking about the evolution of music, what we're really talking about is people coming together, sharing ideas, values, and experiences during a time of horrific enslavement, trying to find some sort of comfort and normalcy after a long day working in a foreign world in the sugarcane fields. These brief moments of celebration were the seeds planted for creolization. The earliest slaves were from the tribes of the Bantu and the Angola. I'm sorry, the earliest slaves were from the tribes of the Bantu from Angola and Congo, the Yoruba from Nigeria and Dahomey, which is also known as modern-day Benin, the Ashanti from Ghana, and Muslim slaves such as the Hausa. That's quoted from Vosberg, page 39. Just to take a break from the script really quick, just so you can see, I went ahead and made this detailed map, kind of showing you where a lot of the Portuguese, when they came down to gather slaves from Africa, these were primarily the areas in which they grabbed from. This is Ghana, this is Dahomey, the one I was telling you about, which is modern day Benin, Nigeria, Niger, as well as from the Democratic Republic of Congo, at the time just known as the Congo, and then Angola. And then as you can see, the Portuguese grabbed from these, this is just the earliest spots that they grabbed from. They, of course, were able to grab from other aspects of Africa as well as some other countries in South America. But at the very beginning, these were some of the earliest ones. Okay, and so we've identified several West African countries where the Portuguese initially went to gather slaves. You'll notice that these countries are located a short distance away from Portugal and are located along the coastline, which was intentional. The Portuguese, of course, wanted to establish a flow of slaves from these ports en route to Rio de Janeiro. Over time, the Portuguese empire expanded and they were able to grab slaves from other locations, like I said before, including South America and the US. Several of these early slaves came from the Yoruba tribe, which has historically originated from Nigeria and Benin. Each of these countries has hundreds, if not thousands, of various instruments they've used for centuries, but I decided to focus on a select few that for sure have wound up in modern-day Brazilian music, or at least traces of them have. Some of the important Yoruba instruments include bata drums, which you can see here, a bata drumming ensemble, Bembe drumming ceremonies, which the bembe is going to be the featured instrument, which I'll talk about in this section, as well as the use of rhythmic items such as agogo bells and instruments like the shekere. These are very, very common instruments in modern Brazilian and African music, just simply because they're very portable, I would imagine, and somewhat easy to make versus some of these more elaborate instruments. Another important aspect to note is that throughout all of Africa, there are several crossovers regarding instruments where one tribe will have an almost identical version of an instrument but call it something different, and potentially it might have a different musical purpose or function. For example, many of these shakers and rattles all serve a similar purpose or function but may have different names or slightly different versions of construction. Again, the specific Yoruban instrument I'd like for us to focus on is the bembe drum. During our graduate percussion lessons with Dr. Mixtaki, we have studied some of these rhythmic and oral traditions, so I thought it would be a great example to highlight specifically. Let's take a look. So the reason why I'm showing you this initial context is because one of the first things that we had really learned about in the graduate percussion lessons and learning about these different styles of music is that yes, we're learning notes and rhythms, but they also serve a significant religious function. And it took me kind of a while to really understand how these all of these different things tie together, such as the music, the instruments, the clothing, the movement, the spirituality, like really kind of focusing on each one of them individually and seeing how they come together. Let's take a look. So the big takeaway from this particular video is that you'll see that this woman is basically saying her blessings or saying a prayer to like each one of these drums, almost like if each drum is like a specific deity in itself, of like, it's almost like you're repenting for your sins or you're wishing for a blessing. So some type of spirituality in that vein. And one other thing you'll also notice is that these drums, they're each kind of decorated with specific ornamentation, decorations, as like this is meant to be like a holy or spiritual instrument that's just to kind of awaken the gods or awaken the spirits, if you will. And so they're all playing different parts as well. So I thought that was kind of interesting to see how the Yoruba culture wound up into Brazil. There are lots of different instruments that I could cover in depth with each of these countries, but for the sake of time, I'm really just going to try to highlight specific ones that really influenced Afro-Brazilian music that we see today. The next country that we're going to look at is from Ghana, another significant contributor to modern day Brazilian music. Ghana has such a rich musical and cultural history that is now known all over the world. More and more, many of the world's top percussion teachers make the pilgrimage to Ghana to study their culture and music. Some of the early slaves in Brazil were of the Ashanti tribe. Some of the iconic Ashanti instruments include the atumpan, which you'll see here, which are large animal skin drums played with L-shaped drumsticks. This specific instrument is quite common in Ghana, but not as popular in early Brazil. I would argue just because of its complexity and just having access to those kinds of materials would be difficult to come by as a slave in Rio de Janeiro. But you'll notice some of these other small instruments, such as the gourd rattle or the toque, also known as the clave, are a little bit more portable. The materials are a little bit more commonly found, and so those ones wound up kind of making their way through history and wound up in Brazilian music. Simply, I think, just because of the ease of construction, and some of these other hand drums are a little bit more complicated to make, and just the materials might be more difficult to access at the time. So let's take a look at some Ghanaian instruments that wound up into Brazilian samba music.
Double C, why, oh.
So I've used this video throughout several different lectures in the past. The reason why I love this particular video is because it shows such a wide variety of these different small portable instruments, such as the agogo bells, all these different types of rattlers and shakers. I think are really interesting to look at. You'll also notice that there are different various hand drums like congas and djembes, but these particular types of variation of drums don't really wind up in Brazil. It's more so these portable instruments that make their way into samba. So let's mainly focus on the portable instruments.
Because I see the sunshine. Why?
So again, the reason why Ghana is like such an important the reason why Ghana is such an important and special place is because for percussionists, like this is really it's like in essence like the motherland for a lot of different types of music and percussion. And I love this video example just because it shows so many different types of beautiful instruments that for sure have wound up in modern Brazilian music now. And something you'll notice too is once the congas and hand drums start coming in, those in Brazil, those get replaced with different drums, such as the surdo or some of the other tenor or high pitched piccolo drums. Let's keep going. The Angola were also another tribe that had significant musical influence on samba carnival music. One of the famous musical styles to come out of the Angola is capoeira Angola. This style of music originated as the as the accompaniment music for the dance combat art form called capoeira, which is how young Brazilian slave men practiced close combat moves as a means of defense or revolt under the guise of it being a religious dance. Some of the featured instruments made their way into modern Brazilian music, including, again, the agogo bell, various scrapers, and the iconic pandeiro, which is a small tambourine, and also small drums known as atabaque. One of the iconic primary instruments in this ensemble is the pitched string instrument called the berimbau. However, due to the fragility of this instrument, it being a bowed or plucked instrument, and its overall fragility, my assumption is that it wound up not making the cut to be transported or be reproduced in Brazil simply because the materials and just the overall construction of the instrument is like way too fragile, and it being in the environment of slaves and constant labor, people moving around. My assumption is that that's one of the reasons why we don't really see the berimbau in Brazil, just due to its overall fragility and construction. But let's take a look at this short video, which kind of shows these instruments used in the capoeira context. Guess my link doesn't work. I apologize. Capoeira Angola. And so in this clip, you can see there are multiple berimbaus. You can see these folks playing the pandeiro. You can also see scrapers and the agogo bells. In my personal opinion, I feel like this style of music is very close to what we hear like in a choro or samba kind of community circle ensemble. You can hear the polyphony, you can hear the pandeiro kind of like keeping time. You can also hear the various clave patterns and the bells. Really listen to the polyphony part, though. That's where we get into the actual songs of Brazil versus just the African rhythms. Very cool. Let's keep going. Last but not least, we also have early slaves that come from the Congo. Now, I will say that although the Congo has its own respective types of music and culture, not a whole lot of those instruments wound up making their way to Brazil. My opinion, again, is simply because these are pretty complicated instruments to construct, like such as the balafon, which is an early predecessor to the marimba. You can see that each of these bars is tuned. It has gourd resonators at the bottom. This is something that probably took a significant amount of time to construct and have all these resources available over in Africa. Also the lakemba as well, which some people mistake it as a kalimba. Again, you'd have to have like the metal prongs as well as creating a resonating chamber. And so again, because of these instruments require a lot of artistry and kind of skills to construct, they weren't as easy, such as like hand drums, shakers, and rattles, which are a little bit easier to construct. I guess that's why these ones didn't necessarily make it to Brazil. So I just also wanted to include a more detailed map outlining the specific African tribes and their geographic locations during the 19th century. So this is just a play off of the African map we looked at earlier, where you can see that in Ghana, it's number 13. You can see that the tribe associated with that area is the Ashanti. You can see that in Benin is number 14, the Dahomey, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that was interesting to just know, like, this tribe map from another source that I had used. So now that we've gotten the opportunity to look at a few of these West African types of music, we can now see that all of these Africans were shipped basically from their homeland into Rio. And so Rio de Janeiro is translated to January River. The reason why the Portuguese initially called it this was because when they were kind of not driving, when they were sailing around, they noticed they noticed a mouth of what they thought was a river, which would lead them to, maybe shortcuts around South America or find just various different shortcuts. And so they had initially called it the January River, but then when they explored it later in the 16th century, they realized it was a bay and not a river. And so this part of the bay was called Guanabara Bay. And so I have this little joke of like, I wonder if uh, they would have called it January Bay instead of January River if they had known better. I just thought that was kind of interesting. And so, with its prime location, the Portuguese quickly established this port town as theirs and started production on sugarcane fields as well as the refineries, establishing the city center and as well as an infrastructure for keeping and maintaining all the incoming slaves that were coming to that area. Now, I wanted to include this particular image because, again, if you are coming into this unknown world and you see this kind of paradise, it almost is like a sense of irony about it because for the Portuguese, this whole area meant opportunity. It meant creating a life for you and your family. You could have land, you could have property, you could have different sources of income to accrue all this wealth in this beautiful area. But on the flip side, for um, the slaves themselves, this beautiful land was unfortunately like a hellhole prison in which they were kept and were forced to adapt for survival. So I just think that this particular image really is like two different images where to the Portuguese, it's this beautiful heavenly landscape, but to the enslaved Africans, it's like even though this is such a beautiful part of the world, like to know what happened there and to know all the suffering that took place, it's just very sobering. It's very sobering to think about. And so, before we progress in this presentation, just a quick disclaimer. The next few images I have gathered are illustrations of African slaves that may entail racist caricature. My intention to using these images is for us to look past the racial surface to further our understanding of how we arrived at modern Brazilian music. Okay, and so, oh, sorry. I will try to make this brief. This image depicts the slave market's holding quarters that is where slaves being brought to Rio were housed in these slave corridors and were in essence recovery centers when they made the very long and hard pilgrimage to Rio. Normally when they arrived in Rio, a lot of them were dehydrated, malnourished, and like needed medical attention. And so at these slave quarters is basically where they recovered and were able to get back to somewhat proper health before they were sold. I'm sorry. This next image depicts a few people in different cultures the illustrator may have seen when encountering various slaves in Rio. Although I realize that some of these illustrations can be seen as racial caricatures, the point of showing you this is that way you can see that all of these different African people are not from a unified culture. I thought this particular image was powerful in showing that African influence in Brazil is quite complex and is actually a range of influences from various parts of Africa. One of the early facts of Rio's city design was that despite it being racially segregated, they had boundaries where slaves could come in and out of the city center and public areas, but not others. This is actually a map of basically the slave boundaries in Rio during the 19th century, to where there's actually quite a few public areas where slaves could come in and enjoy their whatever time off that they had, or during festival celebrations where they may have had half the day off, or if they were lucky, the day off. And so they could kind of go into the city in certain areas and openly kind of celebrate without getting in trouble. However, a lot of these boundaries were like really hardly set in place by things like walls, forts, and gates. And so although that their proximity was fairly close, there was still hard boundaries with these types of barriers, basically. So to kind of play off of the boundary map that I just showed you, um, one pattern was for slaves to work daily as their owners required and to use their artistic talents to earn extra money. Maria Graham knew one such slave whose proper job was to sell fruits for his owner, but who, after had sold his wares for the day, earned extra money by dancing, singing, and storytelling in the streets. Debray pictures slaves who are playing African instruments for crowds of slaves gathered around the public fountains. Although most slaves had to perform on a part-time basis, a minority were able to paint, carve, or play music to the exclusion of other pursuits and for their owners' profit. And so even in this quote, you can see that early in the 19th century, you can see that that I wouldn't say that they're necessarily rubbing shoulders between, African slaves and the white Portuguese, but they were in proximity of each other to just kind of notice these things happening. Although owners may have desired and sometimes required that their slaves work 18 hours a day, slaves needed a respite from their labor. On their own time, they came to gather in the streets and markets of Rio and danced in the squares on religious feast days. Because of the ethnic diversity of the city, they developed a new Afro-Cariocan culture that combined many African and Luso-Brazilian traditions. They forged one band, Umbanda, out of many, and what they evolved was no longer uniquely African or even Luso-Brazilian, but rather a melange of customs that eased the burden of slavery, passed on religious traditions, and contributed to the enjoyment of a social life. Slaves even opened their culture to free men and women who joined them in popular celebrations. So again, this is just evidence that before the abolition of slavery, we are starting to kind of see some of these rubbing of shoulders between different races and cultures, and this kind of loose acceptance of them coming together. So this is kind of like the little bit of the catalyst to the idea of slavery should be abolished. Basically, I found this interesting because it really shows that at this point in time, the Portuguese really started to kind of see these Africans as human beings and not just tools for enslavement. The results of these African slaves being able to come into the city center in public areas and somewhat openly practice their music, culture, and celebrations helped pave the way for acceptance and integration. Just my belief. I believe these images show where that eventual influence came from. You can see it in how the African slaves in Rio dressed for celebrations, their headpieces, intricate embellishments, variety of musical instruments, and movement. So if you kind of just look at some of these early African images, this is an image from the celebration, or it's an illustration, I'm sorry, of the celebration of the new king and queen of the Congo. So if you look really carefully, you can see a lot of what they're wearing, the instruments, the movement, all this parade type stuff is very, very similar to how a lot of the samba stuff, which we looked at earlier. Same here too. You can see that these folks are wearing specific types of clothing. It's almost like, I don't want to say military, but it's like a military influence festival parade type outfits with the top hats and their instruments. Again, it's very similar to what we saw earlier with these, right? Where we can see them wearing similar kind of headpieces, having similar kind of instruments, doing similar kinds of movement. We see those things there. Okay, and of course, in 1888, after the perseverance of so many, it became possible for the abolishment of slavery. This monumental moment in Brazilian history was a major step forward in legitimizing Afro-Brazilian culture. Although this was a major step forward, the free Afro-Brazilians still had to face a lot of uphill battles even after the abolishment of slavery. So now that slavery had ended in Brazil, many of these ex-slaves that were now free had nowhere to go. Slavery was all they had known up until that point. Many of the freed slaves wound up staying in the general area and headed into the surrounding forests. Many of these communities of ex-slaves and their descendants had to work together to develop loose infrastructures called favelas. These loose infrastructures are are community based and are not usually supported by the government in terms of electricity, plumbing, healthcare, or building infrastructure. Consequently, these areas are typically overrun with gangs and violence. Um, and one little footnote here is that the term samba translates to pray. So samba is like a spiritual type of music for the Afro-Brazilians. A very, very quick note on the religion. In post-slavery Rio, free Afro-Brazilians started to openly practice their respective religions, which was to include Afro-Brazilian religions such as Candomblé, among others. Of course, due to the major Portuguese influence, Catholicism still remained the dominant religion in Rio. In Rio today, there are a variety of religions openly practiced, although in many cases, the Afro-Brazilian religions specifically still face some sort of discrimination, even today, as being influenced by witchcraft or sorcery. Although it's tolerated that Afro-Brazilians are able to practice these African religions, there's still even today is some discrimination against them. Okay, so now that we're kind of in a post-slavery world now, we can finally get into the development of the official samba schools and the legitimization of Afro-Brazilian culture. This will be one of my last slides, I promise. Okay, so one of the first samba schools that was developed in the early 20th century was the school known as Deixa Falar, which translates to "Let Them Speak." Later, the group had regrouped as Estacio de Sá. And so you can see, even on, if you go look up information on going to Carnival in 2025 for Rio, it gives you information about all of the current and past Brazilian samba or Rio samba schools, and a little bit about their history, which I thought was pretty cool. I unfortunately don't have a ton of time to go into that, but I just wanted to show you that there are different types of samba schools in different neighborhoods in Rio, and each of them has their own traditions in terms of songs, costumes, choreography, parade themes, all unique to each of these samba schools, which I think is pretty cool. Some of the earliest samba schools were Deixa Falar, like I said, also Escola de Portela and Escola de Meneguin, I think is how you pronounce it. Those were some of the first ones, and you can see it's grown to a lot since then. These are just a couple of examples. The urban samba originally emerged from the slums of the turn of the century Rio de Janeiro. Elderly black religious leaders arrived from rural areas and met frequently with younger, more streetwise mulattoes in the homes of female community and religious leaders. A number of the earliest composers of samba were reported to have been Pais de Santos, or leaders of Afro-Brazilian religious cults. Over a period of some 20 years, the result of this interchange was a softening of the persistent drum beats of African religious ceremonies and an improvisation of lyrics to accompany it, which evolved into the samba as it is known today. The samba became the chief social mobilizer within Rio after a Brazilian community to be invited to a samba in 1928 was roughly equivalent to being invited to an all-night party in the 1980s. So I guess while it was still this taboo kind of thing, it was like a secret club, kind of similar to Prohibition. And so a quote from a prominent samba dancer in the 1970s was, "The samba was our family, our Sunday stroll, our movies, our lover. It was all we really knew of happiness there on the motto," which is a hillside slum. And so even with that quote, it's like, going through slavery, post-slavery, like this was really the only sense of community and comfort a lot of these Afro-Brazilians had. And to be invited into that circle was a very serious, but also like, we really trust you. Of like, if you're going to be invited into our house, as Dr. Smith said, you have, if you know how to behave, you can stay, right? It's like that whole thing. And I've, if you've ever had the experience of being invited to like another culture's space, it's an incredibly rewarding thing. Like for example, I this is a very short story, but I play percussion for a Jewish synagogue in downtown San Antonio, and I am not Jewish. I've never been Jewish. I really don't know a whole lot about Jewish faith, but after playing with this group for about a couple years, like I now have been accepted into that Jewish space of, although you're not Jewish, Sarek, like you respect what we're about, you respect our musical traditions, and so therefore you're invited into this space, and we will treat you as one of our own. That whole thing is such an important process for people to go through. I just thought that was interesting to know, and so it's the same kind of thing. Although recently free, many Africans in Brazil post-slavery face blatant racism from Portuguese Brazilians. Afro-Brazilian religions, again, were seen as witchcraft and sorcery by the larger white society. Um, the samba, with its possible origins and Afro-Brazilian religious celebrations, was not distinguished as a separate musical form for many years. So for a very, very long time, people thought that samba was the same thing as candomblé and all these other dark spiritual religions, and so samba was negatively looked on for a very, very long time. Um, to summarize this last bit, we really started to see a gain in popularity in the 1920s due to the creation of records and record players. And so, as of the 1930s, a lot more of these samba schools started to become created, and then eventually had lots more competition within the Carnival, where it's not just necessarily one samba school. You have all these different samba schools as well as different types of social groups. One of the early social groups, kind of before Afro Brazilians were able to properly be involved in Carnival, were these white elite groups known as grandes sociedades, or high society clubs. And a lot of these clubs were initially a majority white, very wealthy, and then when they participated in the Carnival parades, it was whites pretty much exclusively until mid 20th century, whenever these uh, Afro-Brazilian groups started to form their own carnival parade, and that way you kind of have a mix of the white high society Brazilians and then the Afro-Brazilians coming together to have a unified carnival celebration. And so um, these groups were loose in structure and leadership, and initially was an excuse for the different neighborhoods to come together at carnival time to sing and dance samba. They dressed, sang, and I'm sorry, there's a typo there. So these early Afro-Brazilian schools would often get attacked by the police because they were still in the process of being legitimized, even after post-slavery. And so this is kind of where we start to see some of the early developments of all these different samba schools and their influences on Afro-Brazilian music. Now, where we arrive in modern times is here, where we have all these different established samba schools showing off their production, which features custom songs, costumes, arrangements, choreography, parade floats, and themes. All this cool, unique stuff. So let's watch this final video, which kind of shows all of these different African influences together. Something I always like to ask my classes. I'll give you $1 if you can tell me who this is. So if you're familiar with football, this is the story of Pele. He was basically one of the first soccer superstars that helped put Brazil on the map. And so they tell the story. They tell the stories of Brazil and Rio and of their people through these carnival parade showcases and stories.
O meu povo nunca perde a fé, a vela acesa pro caminho iluminar. Desejo voltar, outro lugar. Vou festejar com a divina proteção. Num céu de estrelas enfeitado de balão. É verde rosa o som da minha devoção.
I forgot to mention this before, but this specific venue is specifically for the yearly carnival competition that happens in Rio. And so this is located in a part of the city that's kind of away from the city center, but this gets used every single year during these competitions, and it's just really cool that they have this. I hope to visit one day.
Já virou religião. Eu vou descer, mãezinha amiga. Falei de meu país, onde quer que eu vá. Levo ovelhas, a rainha do mar. Inaê, Marabu, Janaína. Manda proteger, mãezinha amiga. Falei de meu país, onde quer que eu vá. Levo ovelhas, a rainha do mar. Inaê, Marabu, Janaína. Abrir as portas do céu, chovendo rosário, no laço de fita menina, beijo comunhão, maracujá e guaraná, fluê, meu padroeiro irá sentir, receber, clareia, tem um guerreiro a me defender, vivo todo pro meu orixá, no terreiro, pelas matas eu vou me cercar, mandingueiro, meu maravilhoso, só com a ajuda do santo eu vou vivar meu amor.
So as you can see, it just turns out to be this huge celebration of all of these different influences, both African and Portuguese and Brazilian as well. And so just wanted to share this with you all. Thank you for your time.